So today I'm going to be talking about AirOps. I joined AirOps, a little bit of background on myself. I joined AirOps about a year ago. I spent most of my career in the data space, working in BI and big data and things like that. Joined Matt Hamill, who's in the back, and the other co-founders of AirOps to kind of take advantage of this, what we saw as a revolutionary wave coming into the tech world, and really be the tool that helps teams rapidly build and scale LLM applications easily. So what does it actually mean? I think as everyone knows, or anyone that's tried building with LLMs knows, it's a little bit unique. A lot of reasons why outputs are probabilistic versus deterministic. There are real marginal costs associated with running the models and leveraging them that add up quickly. And also business context is part of the process, right? The code being the prompt that's written and the business logic being basically what lives in that code. And then improving that is something that happens continuously because of the nature of the space and the nature of the technology and how it's always evolving. So kind of the outcome of this is that we see the most successful LLM apps and projects are built collaboratively in an organization, which is why we call it a team sport. So how does AirOps actually do that? So what we focus on is, again, the AirOps Studio, which allows you to build these things, starting with tools, which are basically single use, fairly simple generally, usually just single prompt workflows that do things like text classification, Q&A, relatively straightforward processes, and then can be executed at scale via things like REST API integration into data warehouses, or then used as plugins to other AI processes down the road. The kind of next step of that, or the evolution of that, is a workflow. A workflow is a multi-step process. These can do a huge array of things, but generally include multiple large language model components, and then other logical steps that do things like chain prompts together, create transcriptions, create long-form content, create media content at scale. These are usually run asynchronously, sometimes in batch, and then also integrated often into web interfaces. And then finally, probably the one that most end consumers of AI are most familiar with are chat assistants. So think ChatGPT, but tuned specifically to a business purpose with the right context and with the right process built in. So I'm going to get into the AirOps App Studio. I'm not going to stick around the slides too much, so I'll jump directly into the product. So I'll switch screens, jump over to AirOps. And when you log into AirOps for the first time, you see something like this. So you can see all of the apps that have already been published and what's available in your workspace. And you can also really easily create new apps directly in the interface. So if I were going to create a new app in AirOps, I would click Create New App. I'll choose a tool in this case, and then I would choose Inputs, Outputs, and then everything that happens in between is processing. So I can add an input here. Let's say this one is a question. I can add a processing step. These steps can involve large language models, so an LLM step. They can also involve other things like a memory store. We integrate with a vector database, Pinecone. We also will support kind of like a bring your own vector database solution in the future as well. Injecting other context via API, also using code like JavaScript and Python to do some additional transformation. So if I wanted to add an LLM step, I would select that, open my prompt editor, and design my prompt here just like I would in the OpenAI Prompt Studio or in some of the other prompting tools you've seen. So in this case, I'm not going to start completely from scratch. I'll go into a template, and I'll start kind of from a starting point. Our templates are basically pre-built components of apps that you can use to get them all rolling on a specific use case. One of the ones that we see pretty often is text summarization. It's an obvious use case for large language models. If I open this in my prompt builder, I then now have an input, which is the text that I want to summarize. I have the prompt that goes along with it. So in this case, the prompt says you generate important points on written content. Then it has some additional instructions below. And I can inject the inputs that I've defined in the app into the prompt using a variable. So if I wanted to inject the text input in, I can click the button or I can type it in, but then that becomes a variable that is injected upon execution. And of course, I can modify the other parameters such as temperature, as well as a model that we're using. Currently, we integrate with the OpenAI models, so GPT 3.5, GPT-4, as well as the Anthropic models like Claude. So I would choose my model. Let's say I choose GPT 3.5 with a 16K context window, hit save. I'll save this draft, and I will run this really quick. So I just jump over to this article, Emerging Architectures of LLM Applications. I'm obviously not going to read the whole thing, so I want to run this in my app. I'll paste this in, click execute, and it's going to now run the app. This is just for testing purposes. When I publish this, I can then have an interface that my end users can interact with. But this allows me to really quickly validate first that the prompt is working, and if I have additional steps, that all of those other steps are working too. But I get my output back. It's now summarize the article. I don't have to read the whole thing. And when I'm ready to go, I just click publish. This then becomes available to my end users. Right? If I go back to my home screen, I then have text summarize, and I can use this really easily. So that's an example of a tool. So a very simple workflow that basically does one thing that can be executed on its own to perform that task. But then where it becomes really interesting is when I take that tool and integrate it into other things and go further. So I kind of mentioned earlier, the next evolution of a tool is a workflow. A workflow, again, can contain multiple steps, and these steps can do a lot of different things. An example that we see pretty common for a workflow starts with text as well. One of the ones that we've had a lot of customers explore is transcription. So if I'm building a transcription workflow, right, I have a lot more than just a single prompt here. In this case, I'm taking the audio file that I want to transcribe. So I'm taking a Google Drive link as an input. I can define additional inputs if I want to, but that's my input. I then have a code step that is extracting the ID from that Google Drive file and downloading the file. I can then make an API request to an external service. In this case, we're using DeepGram for transcription, but any transcription service would work. And then finally, we're getting our result back and parsing it. So I have this transcription process that I've used, and then I can add other things layered on top of it to make it a comprehensive workflow. So let's say I wanted to add another step here. I'll choose LLM, and then I can define a prompt that accepts the response from DeepGram, which is a transcription, and then does things like summarize it, generates key points. If it's a sales transcript, can generate a follow-up email or something like that. But it makes it really easy to take that audio file that I've created and then make it actionable very quickly. What's also really nice is I can use any of the other apps or any of the other tools that I've already created. So if I go to step and I go to, instead of LLM, I just select app, I can actually choose that text summarization app that we've already created, and I will inject the variable output from the previous code step. So this is going to accept the response from DeepGram, which is a transcription. I'll use the step 3 output as my input into the summarization app that I already created. And now I have a workflow that will pull a file from Google Drive, transcribe the audio file, return that transcription back, and then create a summarization of that after that. So obviously a lot more complex than just a single task. These can get a lot more complicated than this as well. We have customers that are using similar processes to generate multiple documents, load those documents into multiple locations, and kind of form a comprehensive business process. So what this actually looks like when I use it, I'll go to my history. I'm not going to run it right now because transcription takes, DeepGram takes a minute or so to run. But I would drop this file in. This is an audio recording of Hardcore History, which is my favorite podcast. And then it's going to give me the summary. These are like 4-hour podcasts. So it's going to give me the summary back so I don't have to listen to the entire thing if I don't want to. So all of that is then integrated into one workflow. So going one step further than that, the third type of app that AirOps creates are chatbots. Chatbots are probably the most familiar end user experience. They're typically designed to do more than one thing. And those things that they do can be fairly sophisticated as well. The one thing that makes chatbots especially powerful is the integration of a retrieval step or injecting the prompt with effectively memory. AirOps has a native integration. I mentioned it earlier with Pinecone database. So you can directly in AirOps load a Pinecone database with files and then have those files be referenced in your app directly. So I took the first step of taking our AirOps documentation site, extracting the files from this, and then loading them all into the memory store in AirOps. If I wanted to add another file, I can just go in here and click Add Document. This can also be done via API, and then it can also be done by injecting data from a data warehouse as well. So if you wanted to connect to your Snowflake and load a bunch of data at one time to Pinecone database, you can do that. I mentioned it earlier, in the future, we will have a bring your own vector database option as well, and we'll support other things other than just Pinecone. So this is just really the starting point. So basically here I have a memory store that allows me to catalog all the information from my documentation page. If I type as a test security into here, I'll get all my security related information back, and I can validate that it's returning a response that I would expect. So I'll take this as well as a tool that I've previously created, and we'll create a chatbot with it. So in this case, I'll click create new app, and then I'll select chat assistant instead of tool. So the first thing to do is I have to give my chat assistant kind of its identity. So I have to design the prompt around it. Luckily, you don't have to watch me type, so I did already write it. So I'll drop this into here. So you are a friendly AI assistant for AirOps, support assistant for AirOps. Your task is to concisely answer questions asked by an AirOps user, and then also log support tickets in Zendesk. So respond to any customer support question, and then if they have an urgent issue, create a ticket for it in Zendesk to escalate that thing. I can choose, of course, the model that I'm using. So let's say we're using GPT-4. And then I can add tools that I've already created. So let's go and add the memory store first. I'll click memory store. I'll choose the one that I want to use. In this case, there's only one. And then I'll give this memory store a description. The description is what the chat step uses to find the memory store. So I'll just keep it simple. And I'll say AirOps documentation and general information. And then I'll also add another tool for an app. So this is something that I want this chatbot to be able to do for me. I can add as many of these as I need to, but in this case, I want this to generate support tickets in my support application. In this case, it's Zendesk. So I'll go to configure app. I'll choose the app that I've already created. I could use the transcription app that I created earlier or the text summarizer, but I'll use the Zendesk ticket creator. And again, I'll give this a description so it's identifiable. And we can also have multiple versions of these. After I configure this and save these changes, I'll add one more step here to just give this a little bit of additional instruction so that when specific types of requests come from a customer, it knows which one to do. So always use documentation to answer questions related to AirOps. When a complaint is received, use the Zendesk ticket creator. Save changes. I can run this test directly in this interface, or if I save it and publish it, I get an interface like this back. So I can then jump in here and say, how do I use an if statement in AirOps, right? If I want to add a condition to one of my workflows. So this is going to accept the question that I've asked. It's going to use the tool that I've defined, which is, in this case, the memory store. It's going to then search that memory store for the specific question that it's looking for, and then return a response to me. So really quickly, I'm able to inject and deploy chatbots that have all of this context that I built out for without doing a whole lot of additional setup. And I can also take this further, right? If I had a problem with this, or if I'm having another problem, say I tried to use this and I am getting an error message back, unknown error, right? An unhelpful error. I can send that. And because I've instructed my chatbot to, when it receives a complaint or an issue for a customer, use the Zendesk tool, it's now going to take this complaint that I've given, and it's going to then create a Zendesk ticket, give me a link to that ticket, and send that ticket to my support team. So I can create comprehensive workflows that do a bunch of different things. In this case, I only gave it one memory store and one tool. But you can imagine for a support use case, can do a whole bunch of other things. Create tickets, send emails, send follow-ups, send additional examples to a customer. And those can all be separate tools that are integrated into the same place. So after I've done that setup, after I've created a tool, a workflow, or an app, comes probably the most important part, which is actually using this thing. So I can, of course, log into the AirOps UI like this, which a lot of our customers do. I can also deploy these things into my application or my web page or my other interface using REST API to hit the endpoint for this app directly. Endpoints exist for both chat apps, tool apps, and workflow apps. And I can also use the front-end SDK, which allows me to integrate into my front end, and then also take advantage of other things like token streaming, so I can stream tokens in my front end. So it is a really good end user experience with Workflow type apps or with tool type apps, we have a few more options as well. So if I go to like my text summarize that we created earlier, and I want to use this app, in addition to REST API and front-end SDK, I can bash load this. So if I want to generate, 1,000 summaries at one time, I can do that. And I can also integrate into kind of more data-oriented tools like Snowflake or Google Sheets, again, allowing me to run these things at scale. Two options that are coming in the very near future as well. For chatbots, Slack is a pretty big one, or Microsoft Teams type interfaces. And then also embedded, which is basically taking the AirOps UI directly and then plugging it into another interface. One other thing that I like to mention, which is pretty important to the development process and the creation of these, especially when you're viewing it as a team sport, you have multiple people that are collaborating in the same interface. Everything that you do in AirOps is version controlled. So I can roll back to previous versions at any time. I can take these things that I've created and not have to worry about somebody coming in and changing my prompt and ruining it. If I wanted to roll back to a previous version, I can do that very easily. And then we also incorporate other things like observability of the processes that we're running. So everything that you run is logged in history tab. I can see my failure rate, I can see my success rate, and then I can also add evaluations to determine the accuracy of the things that I'm generating. So a few things. On the how much does it cost side, there's the AI consumption, right? You can use our API keys to OpenAI and Anthropic and the other model vendors, in which case we charge directly through and we bill you the amount. You can also plug in your own API key. So you use your OpenAI key, the AI cost, the token cost goes directly to you. And then we basically charge in packages based on how many tasks you have in your workflows. So if you have one step in it, then it just counts as one task. If you have 10 steps in it, it counts as 10 tasks. Things like code and API, no matter how many you have, they always count as one. So if you have like 3 Python scripts in one app, it counts as one task. And then our base plan, which includes, I think, 5,000 tasks, starts at $50 a month. Debugging is something that we are continually working on. I kind of showed you the testing interface. So if I go to one of my more complex apps, like the transcription app, and I run this in the test interface, or I go to my history tab. But in either case, we basically generate logs for each step that sequentially executes. So step 1, when that runs, this is making the it's making the Google Drive request. Then the next step is loading the transcription from DeepGram. But we basically have different logging and different debugging for each step. So like the Python step will return a Python error and will tell you which line the error was on. The LLM step is probably the hardest one, because of the number of variants of the outputs that are coming with that. We are building additional evaluation functionality in the future as well, though. So you can add evaluation criteria for, this text was summarized, but is this the actual type of summary that I wanted back? Is this actually giving me the right structure of summary? Is the output that I'm getting back, a JSON, which I want it to be, or is it some other format? So that's a really good question, and definitely something that we're going to continue to evolve on. I think there's actually a live test on our public website. So if you just go to airops.com, you'll see at least examples of several different types of pre-built workflows that you can run. It's also free to sign up for 7 days. So no matter what package you choose, it's free for 7 days. And then you can test and build workflows. We have a few integrations right now. Probably the most platform specific are Snowflake and Google Sheets. It's really a factor of what use cases can we unblock the fastest that add the most value for our customers. So it's kind of a generic answer, but it's basically what we hear from our user base that we need to build. So we have an integrated Pinecone vector database. One thing that we don't support right now that we are rapidly moving forward with support for is when we make a vector search to the Pinecone database right now, we only return the content field rather than all the metadata fields along with it. So it's kind of limiting in terms of the scope of the response that you can back. And then also the size of the context that we support as well. Right now we chunk things in 1,000 token chunks. So if you have like a continuous piece of text that's longer than that, it's cut off. From the platform side, we're SOC 2 certified and ISO certified and GDPR. So all the certifications that you would expect from a SaaS company. And then on the OpenAI side, we interact, as most do, with OpenAI's API, which means that the data that you send it is not used for training purposes, which is good. And then also, in addition, if you're using your own API key, it doesn't actually go through our account either. It would stay directly within your OpenAI. Today, no, but in the very near future, yes. And that's mostly a factor of a lot of people haven't fine-tuned them yet because of the availability and the cost. But in the very near future, you will be able to, especially as it becomes more. In fact, we will likely have the option to fine-tune models within AirOps as well, which would be pretty exciting. It definitely has a lot of value. I mean, there are a lot of use cases that we have right now that we are that we're working with through with customers that we have used other solutions like prompt injection or a very large context window to get around. Whereas fine-tuning is probably the better solution in the long run. But it's been kind of the faster way to approach the problem. So fine-tuning is definitely what we see as kind of the best case for a lot of large-scale use cases. And it also cuts down on things like the amount of context you have to pass in, removes in a lot of cases the need for a vector database integration as well. So it's definitely an interesting concept.